Welcome back to Tartan Lullaby. I'm Archie, and tonight there's a long, quiet story waiting for you. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find your pillow. Soften your shoulders. Let the day go. Tartan Lullaby tells slow stories of Scotland. Real places, real years, real people, told gently enough to fall asleep inside. There's no music tonight, and no need to follow every word. If you drift off in the first few minutes, the rest will play on quietly without you. That's how it's meant to be. If these stories are a quiet corner you find yourself returning to, a subscription would mean a great deal, and it helps us keep making them. The artwork you see throughout tonight's story is available as a print in our Etsy shop, if you'd like to bring a little of Scotland onto your walls. When you're ready, close your eyes and we'll begin. Tonight, the story behind 4 words: no Scotland, no party, a new saying, and the very old truth inside it. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. Picture a city square somewhere in Europe. Morning, the visiting supporters have gone home, the trains and the coaches pulled away before dawn. What is left is quiet, cafe chairs stacked, a few pigeons, the odd blue and white flag forgotten on a railing. The locals come out into that quiet and they say something. They say the place felt alive while the Scots were here. They say it warmly. Not every crowd leaves that behind. Not every crowd earns that. It is the same story from city to city, from the streets of Seville to the squares of Amsterdam, from the old lanes of Paris to the waterfront at Gelsenkirchen. The same report, offered without prompting. The Scots brought something. They brought colour and noise and linked arms and songs sung at the sky. They bought rounds they did not have to buy. They stayed to help an old woman with her trolley. They apologized for nothing except leaving. And then they left, and the square went quiet, and the locals, finding a blue scarf on a bench or a small tricolor tucked under a stone, said, "We would not have minded if they had stayed." Nobody quite agrees where the chant started. Some say it came from a supporters' bus somewhere on the way to a qualifier. Some say a pub in Glasgow, a Tuesday night, someone with a marker and a bedsheet. Others insist it surfaced online first, a caption under a photograph, and moved from a screen into a throat and then into 10,000 throats. The records do not settle it. The chant arrived, as good things do, without paperwork. What it claims is simple. Scotland at a tournament is not a footnote. It is not a tolerated presence. It is an ingredient. Take it away and something essential is missing. The party is diminished. The record shows that. The words are recent. Nobody pretends otherwise. But the spirit inside them is not recent at all. That spirit has a long history. It runs back through football stadiums and emigrant ships, through the trenches and the New World, through harvest fields and hearthside gatherings. It runs back to a particular kind of evening, a fire in a long room, a door left deliberately unlocked, someone passing with a bottle, not because the host is wealthy, but because the host would be ashamed not to share. That is where we are going tonight, not to the stadium, to the room before the stadium existed. To the ceilidh, the gathering, the oldest Scottish party of all, settle in. The fire is low, the night is long. Chapter 1. The ceilidh. The word itself is Old Gaelic. It means a visit, a gathering, a coming together. It does not originally mean dancing, though dancing came to fill it. It means, at its root, people in a room on purpose together. Before the halls and the caller and the accordion band, the ceilidh was simply the house visit. A neighbor appears at the door. You open it. You bring them in. You do not ask if they have eaten. You assume they have not, and you feed them. This was not sentiment. It was code. In a landscape that could kill you, the code of hospitality was the difference between a community that survived and one that did not. You took in the traveler because one day you would be the traveler. The fire was the center. Every ceilidh gathered around heat. The hearth was the oldest piece of furniture in any Scottish home, older than the table, older than the bed. It was where the family slept in the hardest winters, where the animals were brought in from the frost. Around that fire the rules were understood without being spoken. You did not sit in silence. You did not let a guest feel like a burden. You offered what you had: warmth, food, drink, and the one thing every person carried for free, which was a turn. The turn, this is the part that matters. At a ceilidh, everyone was expected to contribute, not just the gifted, not just the professional, everyone. A song if you had one, a story if you knew one, a tune on whatever instrument you could manage. The host did not excuse you because you were shy or because your voice was rough. Shyness was understood, gently overruled, then celebrated when you had finished. The roughness of a voice was never the point. Participation was the point. A man who sat in silence all evening was mildly suspect. Not cruel, not ostracized, but noted. What are you keeping back? The ceilidh was a declaration: I am here. I have something to give. I give it freely. Some gave more than others. The Ceanachie gave the most. The Ceanachie was the keeper of stories, the oral historian, the person who held in memory the lineage of the clan, the tale of the battle, the name of the great-grandfather nobody else remembered. The Ceanachie did not invent. That is important. The Ceanachie remembered accurately and at length and passed the memory to the room as a gift. History was not kept in books in these communities. It was kept in people. The ceilidh was how it was transferred. You can hear the echo of this in the Scotland shirt worn to a tournament today. On the back, sometimes a name. On the front, a badge. And in the stands, a song that names the nation, that says we are still here, we have not forgotten who we are. The fire in the ceilidh house burned peat in most of Scotland for most of its history. Peat burns slowly. It burns with a particular smell, earthy and ancient, faintly sweet. The room filled with it. Your clothes carried it home. The smell is one of the things emigrants described first when they wrote letters back from Canada or New Zealand or the Carolinas. Not the faces, not the voices, the smell of the peat fire. The body remembers what the mind struggles to keep. Ale if the family had it, whisky if there was a bottle. The whisky was not poured in rounds or measured in units. It was past. The bottle went hand to hand, lip to lip if there was only one cup, and nobody thought anything of it. This is the part of old Scottish hospitality that catches modern visitors off guard. The intimacy of it, the sharing of the cup, the sharing of the plate, the sharing of the bench beside the fire. Personal space was a luxury nobody had invented yet. The children were not sent to bed for the ceilidh. This is another thing worth knowing. Children sat at the edge of the gathering and listened. They heard the Senachie's stories. They heard their grandmother sing. They carried it forward. The ceilidh was how a culture reproduced itself. The dancing came later in the evening, after the food and the stories and the slower songs. The fiddle player, if there was one, moved from tune to tune with very little pause. Reels first, then jigs, then the slower airs when feet grew tired. Nobody choreographed the ceilidh. Nobody assigned the dances or issued instructions. The forms were known because they had been learned young, in the same room, watching the adults. The ceilidh taught itself, generation by generation, in the very act of being held. There were rules about how a ceilidh ended. You did not simply leave. You waited for a natural pause, a moment when the fire had dropped and the music had slowed. Then you stood, thanked the host by name, and walked out into the night. The walk home was part of it. Cold air after the warm room, stars if the clouds had cleared, the sound of your own breath, the feeling of having been somewhere real, having given something and received something, carrying both home through the dark. The ceilidh was not a performance. It was not a spectacle with an audience. Everyone present was a participant. The host fed you. You gave your turn. The Senachie remembered. The fiddler played. The children watched. The old woman sang. All of it was necessary. Hospitality in this tradition was not generosity as a personal virtue. It was a structural feature of the community. The word in Gaelic, sometimes translated as hospitality, has a weight closer to obligation, to duty, to the thing you owe one another simply by being human and alive in the same cold place. The door left unlocked. The fire kept going past the hour when sensible people sleep. The extra cup, the extra plate, the corner of the bench pulled slightly wider. These were not grand gestures. They were the ordinary texture of the life. And yet, across the centuries, the places that held this texture produced something recognizable. Travelers wrote about it. Academics studied it. Visiting writers in the 18th and 19th centuries, arriving cold and skeptical at a Scottish farmhouse, left describing warmth they had not expected. Samuel Johnson, not known for softness towards Scotland, recorded the welcome he received in the Highlands with genuine surprise. He had expected discomfort. He found care. He found the fire tended, the food offered before he asked, the host attending to his ease as a matter of course. This was not universal. There were hard men and cold houses. Poverty drew its own lines, but the ideal was persistent and widely shared. You brought the stranger in. You gave what you had. You let them contribute. You sent them back to the dark with something they had not arrived with. The ceilidh was also quietly a place where grief was held. After a death, the community gathered. Not in a church, not formally, but in the house, around the body, through the night. Songs were sung, stories were told about the dead. The ceilidh gave the lineage. This is the wake, which Scotland shares with Ireland and with other old cultures, and which modern life has reduced to an hour or two in a function room. The original wake lasted until dawn. It was a ceilidh in the presence of loss, which is a very particular and very necessary thing. Joy and grief were not separated in this tradition. They lived in the same room at the same fire. A song could hold both. A story could turn from laughter to silence without warning. The ceilidh held the full register, and the community was made stronger by it. There is a phrase in Scots Gaelic sometimes translated as the gathering of the people. It carries no suggestion of occasion or reason. The gathering is its own reason. People come together because people come together. The being there is the point. The party is not in service of anything. It is the thing itself. When the Tartan Army fills a foreign square, linked arms, breath visible in the cold air, lit windows above them and strangers leaning out to watch, something very old is happening. Nobody has planned it. No host has issued invitations. The door opened and they came in. They brought their turn, a song by name, a flag, a story about a grandfather who had followed this team when following this team was much harder than it is now. They offered it to whoever was in the square. The square accepted. The ceilidh is not gone. He is just wearing a replica shirt. She is just wearing blue face paint and laughing at something that happened on a train from Brussels. They carry the memory of the nation in their mouths, and they give it freely to anyone who will listen. The ceilidh did not require a building. It required a fire. And sometimes the fire is a flare, held at arm's length in a crowd, throwing red light on the faces of 10,000 people who have come a very long way to be precisely here. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The embers are low. The last dancer has sat down. The fiddler is reaching for the last cup of whisky. Outside, frost is settling on the grass, and the walk home through the dark is waiting. Rest for a moment in the room. Feel the warmth on your face, the cold on your back where you are turned from the fire. Hear the low murmur of the last voices, unwilling to stop, reluctant to let the evening end. This is the afterglow. This is the part the ceilidh was always moving toward. Not the reel at its fastest, not the song at its loudest, but this. The room quietening, the fire falling, the people settling into something that is almost sleep, but not quite. The gathering gave what it always gives: memory, warmth, the feeling of having been known briefly and completely by the people in the room. Tomorrow the work begins again. The frost will need dealing with. The animals will need feeding. But tonight someone sang. Someone told the story of a great-great-grandfather none of them had met. Someone passed the bottle. Someone danced past the hour they had planned to stop. And no one left without having given something and received something in return. That is the ceilidh. That is the code. And it is very old, and it is very much alive, and we will follow it forward now through the centuries, through the festivals and the vigils and the New Year fires and the emigrant ships. But not yet, for now the fire, the frost outside, the last voice dropping to a murmur, let the warmth hold you, let the story settle. There is more to come, but it will keep until morning. Sleep comes first. Good night from Scotland. Scotland has always known that people need more than work. They need a reason to stop, to gather, to mark the turning of the year with something that has nothing to do with labour. The joy calendar of old Scotland was not a set of occasions bolted onto life. It was woven through it, season by season, from the first green shoots to the first hard frost. The feast days came first. Holy days on the church calendar gave whole parishes a reason to set down tools. Saints' days and quarter days pulled communities together in the one place, usually a flat piece of ground near the church or the market cross. Not yet dancing, just standing together, which was enough. Then the fairs, twice or three times a year in most towns, once in many villages. The records from borough councils across lowland Scotland show traders, entertainers, travelling musicians, and ordinary folk making a journey of several miles just to be in a crowd. The fair bustled with commerce by day and softened into conversation by night. There was ball play too. The old folk football matches, played on holy days across the parishes, drew in hundreds. This series visited those games in its first episode. They were not really about the ball. They were about the whole town on the same field, moving in the same direction, belonging to the same place for one cold afternoon. But the harvest was the great hinge of the year. When the last sheaf came in, Scotland breathed out. What the records call the cairn, the harvest home, was a celebration that belonged to everyone who had worked the land that season. The farmer fed the labourers danced. The night stretched as long as it needed to. The cairn was not elegant. It was held in barns, in fields still smelling of cut straw, under skies beginning to sharpen toward autumn. The light came from lanterns and open doors. The warmth came from bodies close together and from whatever was passed around in a cup. It earned the disapproval of the kirk almost everywhere it was celebrated. The kirk's disapproval did not stop it. If anything, the records suggest the disapproval added a faint edge of pleasure to the whole affair. Communities that worked together all summer found something clarifying in also celebrating together, beyond the reach of any formal instruction about how joy should look. The penny wedding was something else. Stranger, more generous, almost impractical in its scale. When a poor couple wished to marry but could not afford the celebration, the parish solved the problem collectively. Each guest brought a contribution, a penny Scots, food, drink, a loaf of bread. Together they funded a feast no single household could have managed. The records from 17th century Scotland describe penny weddings that ran for days, not hours, days, music from whatever instruments were to hand, dancing that stopped only when feet demanded it, meals that kept appearing, sleep taken in corners, followed by more dancing. The couple at the center of it all, surrounded by the whole of their community, held up by it. The General Assembly of the Church of Scotland eventually moved against penny weddings. They had become, in the Kirk's view, occasions of disorder. What the Kirk called disorder, the records suggest, was simply an entire parish being in the same place, fed and warm, with no reason to leave. The Kirk was not wrong that something ungovernable was happening. It was wrong that ungovernable was a problem. Wakes, too, were gatherings. The Scottish tradition of sitting with the dead through the night before burial was not only about grief. It was about the community declaring that it would not leave one of its own alone, even at the last. Food was brought. Stories were told. The person who had died was present in every sentence spoken about them. So Scotland had built, over centuries, a calendar of gathering, a rhythm of coming together that did not depend on any single occasion. The ceilidh, the harvest home, the penny wedding, the wake, the fair, each one different in its mood, all of them the same in their structure, everyone in the room, no one left outside in the cold. What that calendar built, without anyone deciding to build it, was a shared instinct. The instinct that the proper response to anything significant, whether joy or grief or the turning of a season, was not to experience it alone. Scotland did not invent this instinct, but Scotland, in its particular geography of tight glens and hard winters and long shared labour, pressed it deep into the way people lived. And then came the one moment in the year when all of that compressed energy, the whole calendar of gathering, had to find its fullest expression. One night when the whole of Scotland together marked the ending of what had been and the beginning of what might come. That night is Hogmanay, and Scotland came to own it in a way that no other nation quite has, because of something that looked, at the time, like a loss. Here is the history. In 1560, the Protestant Reformation arrived in Scotland with particular force. The reformers, led by John Knox and the kirk he built, were deeply suspicious of the old Catholic feast days. Christmas, with its candles and its pageantry, and its roots tangled in both Rome and older northern celebration, was exactly what they wanted to sweep away. The suppression built slowly at first, then hardened. By 1640, the Scottish Parliament had passed legislation making the celebration of Yule officially illegal. Christmas in Scotland was not merely discouraged, it was forbidden. The records from church sessions across the country show prosecutions for carol singing, for baking Yule bread, for celebrating in ways that had been ordinary for generations. Christmas would not be restored as a public holiday in Scotland until 1958. That is nearly 400 years of midwinter austerity. 400 years during which the world's instinct to celebrate the dark of the year, to light a fire against the longest nights, had to find somewhere else to go. As it went to New Year, it went to Hogmanay. Hogmanay is an old word. The records suggest it was in use at least from the early 1600s. Its exact origin is still debated, and honestly the scholars have not agreed. Some point to French, some to Norse, some to older Scots. What is not debated is what it became. It became everything Scotland was not allowed to do at Christmas, done instead at the stroke of midnight on the 31st of December. The kirk was not entirely comfortable with Hogmanay either. There were attempts to constrain it, but the formal legal force that had been aimed at Christmas was never quite marshalled against the New Year in the same way. And so Hogmanay took root and grew into something vast and particular and unmistakably Scottish. The traditions that built up around it are worth holding in the mind one at a time, because each one carries something of the old gathering instinct. First footing. On the stroke of midnight or shortly after, you leave your house and you walk to the house of someone you care for. You do not go empty-handed. You bring coal for warmth through the year ahead. You bring shortbread for enough to eat. You bring whisky for good cheer and comfort. The gift is practical. The meaning underneath it is not. The first footer crosses the threshold as the new year begins. They are the first person to enter the house in that new year, and what they bring with them, the warmth, the food, the drink, matters. The records suggest a preference, lingering from much older times, for a dark-haired first-footer. Light-haired visitors at a winter threshold carried older, darker associations. Scotland remembered. What first footing built, street by street, was a whole parish in motion. After midnight, the windows of a Scottish town were lit. People moved between them, carrying their parcels, their breath visible in the cold air. The route from your house to your neighbor's house and on to the next one was the same route you walked every other day of the year, but tonight it felt chosen. A gift of coal, a gift of shortbread, a tot of whisky poured at the kitchen table, standing up, still wearing your coat. This was not a formal occasion, it was an intimate one. The value was not in the objects, but in the crossing of the threshold. You came, you did not stay away. The year could begin now. The bells at midnight pulled all of it together. Across the country, from the town clocks and the church towers, the ringing of the New Year in. People stood in the street for it, or leaned out of windows, or gathered at the top of a hill to hear the sound carry across water. The bells said the same thing they had always said. The year is ending. The year is beginning. You are here. And then there was the song. It was written by Robert Burns. He took an old Scots fragment, a few lines he had gathered from an elderly man in Ayrshire who remembered hearing it sung, and he made something new from them. He called it Auld Lang Syne. He sent it to a friend in 1788, describing it as an old song he had found. The records suggest the truth was more complicated and more generous than that. Burns did not just transcribe the old lines. He shaped them, added to them, gave them a structure that would carry across rooms and across years. The song he wrote is about the simple question of whether old friends and old times should be forgotten. Its answer is in the raising of a cup, the linking of arms, the presence of the people you love in the same room as yourself. Burns died in 1796 at 37. He did not live to see what the song became. He could not have imagined it. Auld Lang Syne is now sung at midnight on the 31st of December in more countries than any other song in the world. Scotland gave it to midnight, and midnight carried it everywhere. In the hours after midnight at Hogmanay, after the bells and the first footing and the song, the rooms of Scotland settle. A fire burning low, a last dram poured and shared, the shortbread nearly gone, the coal beside the hearth. People not quite ready to go home, not because the celebration demands it, but because it is too good to end. There is a particular quality to that hour, something between the night and the morning. The year behind you now, with everything it contained. The year ahead not yet begun. The room holding everyone you brought to it, lit softly, quiet in a way that feels full rather than empty. Scotland made this. Scotland made this night the one every other nation borrowed. Christmas was taken away. Scotland moved its midwinter fire, moved it 400 years forward through the dark to the last night of the year, and there it burned so brightly that the whole world came to stand beside it. So when you trace the spirit behind the words "No Scotland, no party," you find it here too, not in the noise of celebration but in its structure, in the fact that Scotland, for centuries, looked at midwinter and said, "We will not go through this alone. We will gather. We will cross each other's thresholds. We will carry gifts and link arms and sing the song about not forgetting." Scotland did not just learn how to party. Scotland learned, through necessity and through loss, how to make gathering into something sacred. And New Year's Eve, all over the world, is still lit by that learning. Every writer dreams of being remembered. Robert Burns is remembered differently from the rest. He gets a dinner, a candlelit supper once a year on every continent on earth. The haggis carried in on a silver plate, the whisky poured, the toasts given. No other writer in the world has this, just Burns. He was born in January 1759 in a two-room clay cottage in Appalachia. His father was a tenant farmer. The family worked hard ground in hard weather. Burns helped from childhood. He ploughed, he dug. He knew cold mornings and aching backs and the particular silence of a field before dawn. He also read everything he could find. He taught himself French. He absorbed the old Scots songs and ballads that the people around him carried in their mouths like heirlooms, and he wrote, quietly at first, poems folded into his jacket pocket, verses scratched out in the margins of his days. In 1786, he published his first collection, the Kilmarnock edition. It sold out almost immediately. Edinburgh came calling. The ploughman poet was suddenly in drawing rooms, being stared at by people who had never spoken to a farmer before. He handled it with grace and with a quiet, watching amusement. He spent the rest of his short life collecting and writing. The songs he gathered and shaped, the verses about mice and men and the indignity of lice and the tenderness of love. He died in 1796, 37 years old. Eyre grieved. Scotland grieved. Then something unexpected happened. 5 years after his death, 9 of his friends gathered in a cottage in Ayrshire to mark his birthday. They toasted him. They read his poems aloud. They ate together. It was modest, quiet, affectionate. It was not meant to become anything, and yet it did. The tradition spread, first through Ayrshire, then through Scotland, then outward with every Scot who left. Burns' suppers appeared in the cities of the New World, in garrison towns, in colonial outposts, in the back rooms of pubs in cities that still smelled new. Wherever Scots went, they brought the supper with them. The structure settled into something almost liturgical, a welcome, a grace, his own grace, spoken before the meal, the soup, then the haggis, brought in with ceremony, a piper leading it to the table, and then the poem. The address to a haggis, spoken aloud, with a knife raised and plunged at exactly the right moment. The haggis opened, steaming, everyone watching. It is theatre, honestly joyful theatre, and no one pretends otherwise. The laughter is part of it. Then the meal, then the toasts. The immortal memory is the serious one, a speech about Burns, his life, his work, what he means. Given well, it takes 20 minutes and leaves you wanting to read everything he wrote. Given very well, it leaves you a little tearful. Given very badly, it still does. There is also a toast to the lasses and a reply from the lasses, and the tone shifts here, gently irreverent, fond ribbing between the halves of the room. Burns would have approved. He was fond of women, and they were generally fond of him, and he wrote about both halves of humanity with the same careful attention. Then the singing. His songs passed around the table, verses offered by whoever knows them, some voices stronger than others, none judged. Auld Lang Syne eventually, of course. The name of it spoken, the verses begun, the arms linked. Nobody quite reaches the high note. That is also part of it. And then people sit back. The candles have burned lower. The whiskey glasses hold their last inch. Someone reads a poem quietly. Someone tells a story. The evening does not end so much as it slows, settling like peat ash, warm and spent and content. This is how it happens in Edinburgh and in Buenos Aires, in Cape Town and Melbourne and Vancouver and Tokyo, in university common rooms and hotel function suites and kitchen tables laid with borrowed silverware. The same grace, the same poem, the same knife in the haggis, the same warmth. Why does it endure? Partly because Burns himself endures. His best poems still reach through the years and touch something true, the empathy in them, the democracy, the stubbornness about human worth regardless of birth or money or rank. That stubbornness does not age. And partly because the supper is a gathering. It asks people to sit together and say, this mattered, this person mattered, this way of seeing the world is worth carrying forward. Most annual rituals celebrate a birth or a victory or a saint. The Burns supper celebrates a mind that is rarer than it sounds. There is a warmth to Burns' night that feels older than the supper itself. It draws on something the Scots have always known how to do, how to make a cold January bearable with fire and food and the sound of someone saying something true. The party is the point. Burns would have understood that. He wrote in one of his most quoted letters that he was sometimes afraid his heart was capable of nothing but song and passion. He meant it almost as a confession. History has decided otherwise. It turns out a heart for song and passion is exactly what lasts. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a hall somewhere, January, frost on the outside windows. Inside, the candles, the tables, the smell of broth and wool. Someone is on their feet raising a glass. The words travel around the room. Burns, they say, the immortal memory. And somewhere in the back of the hall, someone smiles. In Chapter 5, the pipes at the front. When Scottish regiments went to war, they did not leave Scotland behind. They carried it with them. In the kit, in the music, in the particular stubbornness about how a gathering should be done. The party, it turns out, travels. Scottish soldiers have served in nearly every theatre of conflict the modern world has produced. Some of that history is complicated. Some of it is heavy, but inside it, persistent and human, is this. Wherever the regiment went, they eventually found a flaw and cleared it, and someone brought the pipes. The piper was not only a battle musician. That is the image that endures, and it carries its own weight, and it belongs to that weight. But the piper was also the one who played at the regimental dance. The ceilidh in the field, the ball in the garrison town, the music that meant home. Garrison towns are worth a pause. Think of a town somewhere far from Scotland, India, Egypt, Canada, the Caribbean. A regiment is posted there. Months pass, years sometimes. The men build a life within the posting, and in that life they build the party. The Caledonian Ball became a feature of garrison culture wherever Scottish regiments were stationed. A formal event, properly organized, the dresses brought out, the officers in full dress, the floor polished, the piper engaged. Local guests invited, often. Something passed across that floor to people who had never seen a reel before. The records from India in the 19th century describe regimental balls that bewildered and delighted the local guests in equal measure. The speed of the dances, the patterns of the sets, the sound of the pipes at full strength in an enclosed space. It was unlike anything else, and the unlike anything else was precisely the point. In some garrison towns, the tradition outlasted the regiment. Long after the soldiers left, the local community kept the dances, kept the tunes. A Caledonian society formed where no Scots were left, only people who had learned the steps from people who had learned them from the regiment. The party had put down roots. The regimental pipe band carried its own ritual. The beating of retreat at sunset, the slow march at the close of a ceremony. These were not purely military functions. They were the music of transition, of the end of the day, of the moment when the formal gives way to the human. Soldiers who were not Scottish wept at them. That surprised no one. Morale is a real thing and a fragile thing. The commanding officers of Scottish regiments knew it. The annual regimental dinner, the St. Andrew's night, the Burns supper held somewhere unsuitable, a mess tent in the mud, a requisitioned building, a ship's wardroom below decks. These things mattered. They said, "We are still ourselves." There is a famous account, often retold in regimental histories, of a Hogmanay celebrated in the field. The specifics vary by telling, but the shape is always the same. It was cold, it was difficult, there was very little to hand, and someone produced a fiddle or a set of pipes or simply started singing. By the end, the year had been seen out properly. The soldiers who came home carried the gatherings with them. Regimental associations formed in every Scottish city and town. Annual dinners, pipes at the door, the old songs. Men who had stood in cold places together sitting now in warm halls, the glasses raised. The gathering as memory, the party as the proof that they had come through. There is something in this that resists easy description. It is not triumphalism. The men who gathered at those dinners had often lost people. The empty chairs were understood without being named. The gathering included the absent. That is what a gathering is. at its deepest, a way of holding everyone together, including those who are no longer here. The pipes carry this. The lament and the march live in the same instrument, played by the same hands. The pipe band at a regimental funeral moves at the same pace, uses the same reeds as the pipe band at the Hogmanay dance. The Scots understand this. Both things are true at once. Scottish regiments are still active. The pipe bands still play. The regimental suppers still happen. The tradition has not required preservation because it has never stopped. It has simply continued, adjusting its occasions, keeping its shape. The form that 700 years of gathering made is stubborn enough to hold. When Scotland qualified for major tournaments after long absences, the regiments felt it too. Men who had carried Scotland into hard places, watching Scotland return to the pitch. The Tartan Army in the stands, wearing the same colours the regiments once wore into the field. The connection is not metaphor, it is lineage. Think of a garrison somewhere long ago. The regiment has been away from home for 14 months. It is winter. Someone has found enough floor space for a set. The piper tunes. The first couples take their places. Outside, whatever the world is doing, it is doing it. In here, for now, the music starts. The oldest test of a community is whether it can hold together when the conditions are hardest. The Scots took the gathering into the hardest conditions they found. The haggis carried onto a ship. The ceilidh held on a warehouse floor. The toast given with whatever was to hand, whatever vessel, whatever light. It held, it always held. That is the thing the history is trying to say, quietly, without flags or drama. The gathering held. The party survived. The spirit came home with the soldiers and sat back down at the kitchen table, and someone poured a dram, and the talk went on into the small hours. There is a particular quality to the last hour of a regimental dinner. The speeches are done, the pipes have played. The older men are quiet now, the memories close. Someone will sing something unaccompanied, a slow air, the kind that does not need accompaniment. The room listens, nobody moves. That silence is not the silence of an ending. It is the silence of something held. The gathering does its deepest work here, in the stillness after the noise, when all the people in the room know without saying it that this is what they came for. Not the food, not the ceremony. This. Burns understood it. The men who danced in garrison towns understood it. The pipers who played through cold mornings understood it. The Tartan Army in the stadium understood it, though they might put it differently. You gather, you hold together, you mark the thing that matters. No Scotland, no party. The chant is recent. The spirit it names is not. It goes back through the Tartan Army, back through the garrison balls, back through the Burns suppers in borrowed halls, back through the Hogmanay fires, back through the ceilidh barns and the festival grounds, and the great clan gatherings on hillsides before any of it had a name. The soldiers came home. The emigrants came home, or their grandchildren did. The diaspora kept the dances and the songs alive across every ocean. And eventually Scotland came back to the tournament, and the fans filled the stands, and the chant went up. Not a boast, not a taunt. a statement of something that has been true for a very long time, that Scotland brings something to the gathering, that the gathering is better for it, that the party has always, in the end, included Scotland. It is late now. The dinner is long over. The piper put the pipes down an hour ago. The last waltz was danced in slow half-time, feet barely lifting, the couples leaning into each other just enough to keep moving. Outside, the frost is settling on the street. Your breath makes a small cloud. You can still hear, very faintly, someone laughing in the hall behind you. The lit windows throw rectangles of amber onto the pavement. You walk home through the cold. The night is quiet. Scotland is quiet, but it is the quiet of a room after company, warm still, the embers holding their glow, the kind of quiet that feels earned. The haggis was carried in. The toast was given. The arms were linked at midnight. The pipes played something slow as the last few people left. Somewhere across the world tonight, in a different January, it is happening again. The same grace, the same poem, the same warmth. A ploughman's words, carried forward by strangers who learned them from strangers, all the way to this room, this candle, this glass nearly empty on the table. Close your eyes. The frost is at the window. The fire is low. You are warm. You are held. Somewhere someone is raising a glass to the immortal memory, and somewhere else a piper is beginning a slow air, and the notes travel out through a cold hall into a colder night. You do not need to follow them. Let the music go where it goes. You are here, you are still. The gathering has already done its work. You can rest now. Sleep, Scotland will be here in the morning. The party, as it always has, will carry on without you for a while. It knows how to do that. It has had centuries of practice. Good night. The pipes cross oceans too. When Scotland emptied in waves across 2 centuries, the people who left carried everything they could not pack into a trunk. The songs, the knack of gathering, the stubborn belief that a year should be seen out together, and a saint's day marked with something worth eating, and that strangers in a hall are just friends you have not yet danced with. The first big wave went south and west. Planters, merchants, physicians, some were Jacobite exiles, some were younger sons with nothing to inherit. They arrived in colonial harbors, built new lives, and then sooner or later found each other. In 1729, a group of Scots in Charleston, South Carolina, founded what the records recognize as the oldest St. Andrew's society of its kind in the world. It was a practical thing first. Scots in a foreign city needed a safety net. If a countryman arrived sick or broke, the society helped. But it was never only charity. St. Andrew's night meant a dinner. A dinner meant haggis and whisky and the smell of a homeland that existed now mostly in memory. The gathering was the point as much as the fund. Other cities followed the pattern. Philadelphia, New York, Montreal, wherever enough Scots had settled and found their feet, a society formed. The names repeated like a chorus: St. Andrew, Caledonian, Highland, the same instinct reaching for the same shape. A room, a table, candles probably, the shared agreement that tonight, at least, we are in Scotland. The Caledonian balls that followed through the 19th century were something grander. Long tables, formal dress, reels danced until the floor was warm. The records from those evenings describe the same things you find in accounts from the Highlands 200 years earlier. The linked arms, the breath coming fast after a reel, the slow walk back to seats in the afterglow. India, too. Calcutta held one of the most substantial Scottish communities outside Scotland itself. Tea planters, jute merchants, engineers who built the mills, surgeons who kept the hospitals. The Scottish kirk on Middleton Row went up in 1818. St. Andrew's night in the Bengal heat must have seemed an act of pure will, to hold a season that belonged to frost and make it live in a different world. More than 2,000 Scots are buried in the Scottish cemetery in Calcutta. Families, whole careers lived and finished there. They organized, they gathered. The records show a community determined to carry the shape of home intact, not as a museum piece, but as something that still functioned. A St. Andrew's dinner still smelled like a St. Andrew's dinner, even with the ceiling fans turning overhead. The Highland Games travelled further still, where the ground was flat enough to throw a stone and enough Scots were within a day's ride of each other. A Games Day appeared. The Caledonian Club of Prince Edward Island organised competitions in 1838. Events followed across Canada, wherever the clearances had deposited families who still remembered what their grandfathers had done at the Games. New Zealand joined the same pattern. Waipu on the North Island held its first Caledonian gathering in 1871. A community descended from Highland emigrants who had come via Nova Scotia, making the ancient contests new again. The caber, the stone put, the hammer throw, each one a physical memory of something older, the body keeping the form when distance had taken everything else. Australia received its Scots too, and quickly. The gold rushes of the 1850s brought Highlanders and Lowlanders both, following Picts and Hopes to Victoria and New South Wales. The Australian gold rush drew Scots from the same fields that had drawn them to California a few years earlier. Some arrived already experienced. They had already crossed one ocean for a thin chance. In the gold rush towns, Hogmanay was not forgotten. The records are scattered, incomplete, but the pattern holds. Wherever a cluster of Scots found themselves at the turn of a year, someone made the effort. A fire, whatever spirit was available. The singing of Auld Lang Syne by name alone tells you the tradition held. It was sung in camps that had no ceiling and no floor except the earth. Think of it as a flame carried in cupped hands. The gatherings in log cabins along the goldfields were not grand. No gilded hall, no formal pipers hired from a regiment. But the intention was identical to the Caledonian Ball in Charleston or the St. Andrew's Dinner in Calcutta. You find the others. You mark the night. You hold the form of who you are. This is the thread the episode keeps returning to. The party is not a thing you do when everything is well. It is a thing you do especially when you are far from home, when the year is dark, when you need to be reminded that the people in this room are your people. The Scots carried that understanding to every continent. They did not leave it at the shore. There is a quiet bridge here worth naming. The Scots who settled in America, in the southern colonies, in the back country, in the hills that would eventually be called the Appalachians, became the ancestor of a particular kind of gathering. the fiddle tradition, the first foot custom, the call and response songs. A fuller version of that story belongs to a different episode, but the roots run through the same ground. What moved through all of it was not nostalgia exactly. The societies and the games and the Hogmanay fires in foreign camps were not just looking backwards. They were making something in the present. A community that had been scattered was reassembling itself in a new place, building the same connective tissue that makes a group of people into a people. The form of the gathering was the content. By the time football became Scotland's great shared passion, the habit of travelling together was already centuries old. The Scots had form. They knew how to appear in large numbers somewhere unexpected. They knew how a gathering should feel, who was responsible for the mood, what you owed the people around you, and what you owed the place that was hosting you. All of that preceded the terracing. Football arrived in Scotland in the latter half of the 19th century and spread with remarkable speed. By the early 20th century, it was the common language. The songs in the stands were the new container for the old gathering energy. The travelling support had been building quietly for decades before anyone gave it a name. The name that eventually stuck was the Tartan Army. It came into regular use in the 1970s, a shorthand for the tens of thousands who followed the national team away from home. In those early years, the reputation was mixed. The travelling was real. The passion was real. But the behavior, on occasions, was not the kind that made a host city glad to see you coming. The low point, if you are being honest about the record, was Wembley in 1977. Scotland had won 2-1. In the celebration that followed, supporters spilled onto the pitch. Goalposts came down. Turf was torn up and taken home. The images were reproduced widely. There was genuine pride in the result and genuine embarrassment about what followed it. The response was constructive. In 1980, after further trouble at the same fixture, the Scotland Travel Club was established. Its stated purpose was responsible fan behaviour. It was a decision by supporters and by those who cared about what the travelling support meant to take ownership of the culture, to ask what kind of army this should be. The answer, worked out over years, was generous. The shift was not instant. Culture rarely changes on a date you can circle. But through the 1980s, something was moving. Supporters who travelled were thinking about how they arrived, how they behaved in the squares and the bars and the streets of host cities. The kilt, the banter, the willingness to pose for photographs with strangers. A deliberate friendliness, not performed but practiced. The 1992 European Championship in Sweden was where the outside world took notice. Scotland did not progress beyond the group stage. The football was not the story the Tartan Army took home from that tournament. UEFA awarded the supporters a fair play prize. Around 5,000 had travelled. The contrast with other fan groups at that tournament was noted, reported, and remembered. Sweden gave the Tartan Army something that no result could have given them, a reputation that had nothing to do with whether the ball went in. The prize said, "You came here, you brought your noise and your colour and your kilts, you were kind to the city, and the city was glad you came." That was the thing worth protecting. That was worth more than a late winner. France in 1998 followed the same shape. Scotland did not qualify beyond the group stage, but in Saint-Étienne and Bordeaux and Paris, the streets had colour in them that the cities did not forget quickly. The fans' behaviour earned recognition again. The Belgian Olympic Committee gave a Fair Play Award after a World Cup qualifier in Brussels. The pattern was becoming the identity. What host cities report consistently is a specific quality of generosity, not just good-humoured but actively warm. Conversations started in bad French or worse German. Children lifted for photographs, money left on bars, hospital wards visited. This is not myth. The records of individual gestures have accumulated into something documented. The Tartan Army understands that it is a guest and behaves accordingly. The kilt is part of it. Wearing a kilt in a foreign city is an act of visibility. You cannot be anonymous. You are offering yourself as an ambassador before you have said a word. That has consequences. It means the interaction that follows carries a flag. Supporters understood this and for the most part chose to carry it carefully. The costume became a commitment. There is something older working in the kilts on foreign cobblestones image. The clansman wearing his plaid in a place that did not know him was identifying himself, saying, "I am from somewhere. These are my people, even if my people are not here." The Tartan Army fan in a German square or a South American street is performing the same act at a distance of several centuries. The fans' charity work became part of the culture too. Money raised for local causes, visits to children's wards, collections organized in city squares. The Tartan Army Sunshine Appeal formalized what had been individual impulse. You arrive in a place as a stranger, you notice what the place needs, and you leave something useful behind. The party that gives as it goes. The thing that sustains it, that keeps 50,000 people willing to travel at considerable personal expense to watch a team that has historically broken their hearts, is not optimism about results. It is the traveling itself, the gathering, the fact that for the week of a tournament or the night of a qualifier, a specific community exists. Kilts and mud and songs and the long walk home. Scotland's absences from major tournaments, and there were long ones, tested the identity without destroying it. The fans kept meeting. Friendlies still drew support. Qualifying campaigns still filled foreign pubs with blue jerseys. The Tartan Army is not contingent on the team's success. It existed before qualification, and it existed during the quiet years, and it will exist after this one. The return to major tournaments, after the long wait, had a specific quality to it, not just the result of a qualifying campaign, but the end of an absence. The fans who had kept traveling through the barren years were still there. Older, some of them, still in kilts. The continuity of the support is itself a kind of record. You do not stop going just because it hurts. Think about what the Tartan Army actually is under the football. It is a traveling festival that happens to schedule itself around matches. The result is the occasion, not the content. The content is the gathering, the strangers who are not strangers, the songs that everyone knows, the shared agreement to go somewhere together and be, for a few days, the same people in the same place. That is the ancient shape reappearing. The ceilidh had no result. The Hogmanay gathering had no winner. The St. Andrew's dinner in Charleston in 1729 did not require a scoreline to justify itself. The gathering was the whole point. The Tartan Army found that shape inside football and made it theirs. The sport gave them a calendar. The spirit was already there. And here, very late, after the last bus and the long walk in, that spirit settles. The kilts are back in the bag. The square that was full of singing this afternoon is quiet now. Somewhere a bar is closing. Someone is looking for their hotel on a map they cannot quite read. The night is cool and the streets are empty and the gathering is becoming a memory. That is always when it counts most, not in the noise of the afternoon, but now in the walk home. The moment when you know you were somewhere together, when the city you borrowed for a week has received you and let you go, and the thing you came for is already becoming a story. That is what the Tartan Army travels for. That is what it always was. In a log cabin on a California hillside in 1849 or 1850, a man from Sutherland or Fife is staying awake past midnight. The year is turning. He knows what this night is. He finds whoever is still awake, and they do what they know how to do. They mark it. The form is the same as the form in the square this afternoon, and the form in the Great Hall 400 years before that. The gathering does not require a country. It does not require a result. It requires only the people and the intention. Scotland goes wherever Scots go. The party emigrated, and wherever it arrived, it kept the same shape. The fire, the linked arms, the walk home in the cold, the slow warm aftermath that is the best part of any night worth having. The candle is almost down now. The last coal in the grate is going orange, then grey. The Tartan Army is asleep in a dozen foreign cities, in a dozen different years all at once. The diaspora is asleep in its log cabins and its Calcutta bungalows and its Cape Breton farmhouses, dreaming, maybe, of frost and a door opening and someone coming in from the cold. Sleep is the long homecoming, the one that always arrives wherever you are. Close your eyes and let the gathering go quiet around you. The arms are still linked somewhere. The last reel has been danced. The walk home is almost over. You are nearly there. Nobody quite agrees where the chant started. A terrace somewhere, a city square, a late night after a qualifier. But that is almost the point. It did not need an author. It sounded true the moment it was said, because the thing it describes is centuries older than football. The spirit inside those 4 words has a name, even if the name keeps changing. It is the same spirit that pulled people toward a fire in a longhouse, toward a town square on a feast day, toward a ceilidh barn on a winter Saturday. The gathering itself is the gift. The result, as any Scots fan will tell you, is weather. 26 years is a long time to wait. From 1998 onward, the biggest stage went dark. Qualification campaigns came and went. Some were close, some were not. The fans traveled anyway. That is the part that takes some explaining to outsiders. The travel did not stop because the tournament was absent. If anything, the absence sharpened something. The qualifier became the occasion. The away end in some mid-table European city on a Tuesday night became the ceilidh. Supporters packed into small grounds in countries most of them had not visited before. They wore the colours, they sang the songs, the old ones, the new ones, the ones borrowed from other traditions. They found each other in hotel bars the night before and in airport queues the morning after. The Tartan Army had been building this way of traveling for decades. By the time the long drought settled in, the culture was already formed. It did not require success to sustain itself. It ran on something else, on the idea that going is its own reward. There is a word sometimes used for it, faith, but that is not quite right or not the whole of it. Faith implies waiting for something to happen. What the traveling support had developed was closer to a practice, a discipline of joy carried out regardless. Home qualifiers had their own texture. A night match at Hampton in October, the floodlights cutting into low cloud, the stands filling slowly from the lower tiers upward. The smell of a Scottish football ground in autumn, damp wool, hot food, cold air. People came from Dundee and Inverness and Dumfries. They came from the islands, catching early ferries. They came from towns that had lost their own clubs decades ago and had nowhere else to direct this particular feeling. They came because it was what you did. The result was not always kind. Sometimes it was very unkind. But the post-match ritual held regardless, out into the city, into the cold, into the pubs that stayed open for it, not to drown anything, to process it together. The gathering continued even when the occasion was difficult. Away trips took on the quality of pilgrimages, not solemn ones, but the kind where the journey accumulates meaning. A long coach ride through Central Europe, a late flight into a city where the street signs are unreadable. The pleasure of working it out, finding the square, finding the others. Other supporters noticed. There are accounts from journalists and rival fans spread across those 26 years remarking on the same thing. The Scots were there in numbers, making noise that did not feel hostile, leaving a good impression in bars and squares across the continent. That reputation did not come from nowhere. It came from something cultural, something older than the football. The instinct to be good company, to find the common ground, to offer a round, to turn a foreign city just for an evening into somewhere that felt like home. The Hogmanay tradition had something to do with it. The Burns night tradition had something to do with it. The ceilidh tradition, the habit of music in public spaces, the comfort with strangers that comes from centuries of small communities needing to make room for everyone, all of it fed into this. It is not a romantic myth. It is something the records suggest, repeated across enough independent accounts to be called a pattern. The Tartan Army, at their best, carried the spirit of the gathering into places that had not expected it. The years passed. The qualifying campaigns continued. 2014 was close. 2018 was painful. Each one became its own chapter in a story that was mostly about endurance, about the refusal to let the gathering dissolve just because the destination kept slipping away. And then quietly, the wait ended. The records show it plainly. Scotland qualified for a major tournament after 23 years away from one and then qualified again. The biggest stage returned. The news did not arrive with fanfare, or it did, but the fanfare was brief. What came after was quieter and more lasting. People who had been watching since childhood, who had never seen their national team at a tournament, now had a date in the calendar. For some supporters, it was a first. They had heard the stories from parents and grandparents, the 1978 stories especially, told with a particular mixture of pride and rueful laughter. Now they would make their own. The preparations had the texture of Hogmanay preparations, lists made, trains booked, accommodation found through contacts, through friends of friends, through the informal networks that the traveling support had built over decades. The kit laid out, the scarf located. A saltire hung from a window somewhere has a different weight after 26 years. It is not a simple flag anymore. It is an accumulation. All the qualifiers watched and lost, the near misses, the late goals, the long drives home, and then finally this. The night before the departure, in living rooms across Scotland, the feeling was close to what a ceilidh feels like in the hour before it starts. The furniture moved back, the floor cleared, everyone knowing that something is about to begin that will be talked about for years. And so they went, into airports at dawn, into trains at odd hours, moving toward a foreign city with their colors and their songs. The chant went with them. 4 words, recently coined, carrying weight that took 1,000 years to accumulate. The foreign squares filled. In the afternoons before kick-off, the same scene that had played out in 100 qualifier cities played out again, but bigger. Linked arms, raised glasses, breath in the cold morning air, lit windows above the square. The result, when it came, was the result. That is not the part of the story that endures. What endures is the image of those squares, the colors against old stone, the sounds that were not reproduced here, but that anyone who was present will carry home inside them. And now it is late. The square is nearly empty. The last few are drifting back toward their hotels, their voices low, their scarves still around their necks. One scarf, blue and white, is tied to a lamp post. Nobody is certain who left it. It will still be there at sunrise. This is where the story has always been heading, not the scoreline, not the tournament bracket. This, a quiet square in a foreign city at the end of a long day, and a piece of cloth knotted to a post as though to say we were here. The chant is 4 words old. The truth inside it is ancient. It comes from the first people who built a fire big enough for strangers to sit beside, who understood that warmth is only warmth when it is given away. It comes from the medieval fair in the market square, the stalls and the noise and the sense that ordinary life had, just for a day, expanded into something larger. It comes from the cattle drove stopping at a clachan for a night, the music starting without being planned. It comes from the Hogmanay crowd in the street, shoulder to shoulder, watching the clock, from the Burns supper table running long because nobody wants to be the first to leave, from the ceilidh that was meant to end at midnight and is still going at 2. A small nation on the northern edge of things, with hard winters and harder centuries, not always peaceful, not always prosperous, but consistent across all of it in one practice, the practice of making a space where everyone fits, where the night is held at bay by company. That is what the chant remembers, even if the people singing it have never put it in those terms. It is not about superiority. It is not a boast. It is a description. Wherever Scotland goes, a gathering happens. The gathering is the point. The ceilidh fire is banked now. The last dancers have gone. The hall is dark except for the glow in the hearth, the kind of light that is warm even when it is almost out. The fiddles are in their cases. The floor will still show the marks of the dancing in the morning. Somewhere far from home, a foreign square is quiet. The stone is cool in the early hours. A street sweeper moves across one end of it, unhurried. Pigeons pick at what was left behind. The lamp post holds its scarf still, blue and white in the grey light. The people who were here yesterday are sleeping now. Some in hotels, some in apartments borrowed from strangers who became something like friends over the course of a week. They will wake in a few hours and begin the long journey back. They will carry the story with them. They will tell it at kitchen tables and across bars and at the next ceilidh whenever that comes. The story will get better in the telling, the way all the best stories do. The near misses will sharpen. The moments of unexpected grace will expand. And somewhere in the telling, the chant will come up. Someone will say the 4 words, and the table will recognize them, and for a moment the foreign square will be present in a Glasgow kitchen or an Inverness front room, the lamp post and the scarf and the early light. That is how a tradition lives, not in the archive, not in the official record. In the repetition of the story, the small faithful act of passing it on, each teller adding their layer without replacing what came before. The pipes are quiet now, let them rest. The reeds can wait until morning. The cold square will still be there, and the scarf, and the memory of the linked arms and the raised glasses, and the breath rising into the night air of a city that was, briefly, ours. It began, as we said at the start, with nobody quite agreeing. A terrace, a square, a late night. The words arrived the way the best words do, already true before they were spoken, already older than the people saying them. No Scotland, no party. 4 words for something that has been true since the first fire was built wide enough for everyone, since the first door was held open in winter, since the first stranger was pulled into the reel before they had time to say they could not dance. That is the inheritance, not a trophy, not a record, a way of being in the world that says, wherever we are, we will make it warm. We will make it something worth staying for. We will not leave until it is time, and when it is time, we will leave well. It is late now, the kind of late that is almost early. The fire is down to its last warmth. The square is empty. The scarf moves once in a small wind and then is still. Sleep now. There is more Scottish history waiting for you here on Tartan Lullaby when you are ready for it. More winter nights and ancient gatherings, more stories told quietly by firelight. But for now, let this one settle. Good night from Tartan Lullaby. The gathering was good. It always is. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. The story is finished, but the night isn't, so let this play on as long as it helps. If Tartan Lullaby has been good company, you're welcome to subscribe so the next story finds you. There's no rush. If you'd like to see the landscapes that go with these stories, the art prints are at Tartan Lullaby Art on Etsy, with mood boards and stills on Pinterest under the same name. The links are in the description below. Until next time, thank you for listening. Sleep well, all is well.